Thank you for venturing out this evening to attend this program. As Robin said, my name is Mark Bedanza, and I'm an author. And my third book was a biography of JoJo White. And interestingly, that came through a variety of circumstances. And I was actually, I'm an attorney also, and I was representing Mr. White. And I remember the first time that I met with him. Those of you who have been around as long as I've been might remember, if you're Celtics fans, the infamous game or the famous game in 1976, the fifth game of the finals that year, pitting the Celtics against the Phoenix Suns. And that game is still referred to as the greatest basketball game ever played. I happened to be between my sophomore and junior years of college, and I was painting houses to pay my tuition. I remember it was a very warm June day, and I went home, my buddy and I went home, and we got cleaned up, and we did what young guys did back then when the drinking age was 18. We went and got a case of Pabst Blue Ribbon, and we went to a friend of mine's house to watch that Celtics game. And I remember being very awestruck by that game and because of its drama. For those of you who don't remember the details, it was a triple overtime game, meaning that it actually went for 63 minutes. JoJo White played 60 minutes of that game, which is a remarkable feat. You might recall a few years ago that there were criticism of LeBron James because he couldn't get the full 48 minutes in a game played. So think about JoJo White playing 60 minutes of a game. JoJo actually became known as the Iron Man of basketball at that point because of his ability to play night after night and sort of essentially stay free of injury. That game, he scored 33 points, and his performance in that game really earned him the MVP of the finals that year. And of course, the Celtics won the championship the following, or 36 hours later in Phoenix by winning Game 6. It was a pivotal game, had a lot of drama to it. I won't give you all the details, but I do write about it in my book. Well, as I was meeting JoJo for the first time when he was in my office, I sort of couldn't help but sort of harken back to that day when I was 20 years old watching him on the basketball court perform so admirably. And I sort of said to myself, geez, I would have never imagined when I was 20 that someday that man that I was admiring and watching that night would be in my office. And I shared that with him. And he took off his championship ring from 1976 and handed it to me, and I could feel all of the physical weight of the gold and the symbolic weight of that moment. And we sort of bonded over it a bit. And it was, sort of a, seminal moment in all of this. And not long after that, unfortunately, JoJo was diagnosed with a brain tumor that nearly took his life. And I got to tell you, of all the people I've known who faced health challenges, he is the most courageous man that I've ever met, and resigned. A very faithful person, and resigned that God would do his will and that he was in God's hands. In fact, I remember coming back, we went out to speak at a college in Iowa after his surgery, and we had to, it was kind of funny that originally the person who sent us out there to speak to a sports management program at a small college in Dubuque sent us on all these planes to get us to Dubuque, and it was going to be like a 14-hour trip. And I said, why don't you just fly us to Chicago and give us a limo? And that'll cut the trip down to like 8 hours. So that's what we ended up doing. But on the way back, after getting up at about 4:30 in the morning to make it to Chicago in time, I went up to the ticket counter, and the lady said, oh, unfortunately, your flight's been canceled. And this was like at around 9 o'clock in the morning. And she said, your flight out is at 9 at night. So I was envisioning spending 12 hours in O'Hare Airport. Not the most pleasant of things. And I went back to tell JoJo, and he just says, we're in his hands. It's just like, I have friends that probably would have, gone through the ceiling at that point if I had told them that. As it turned out, God did watch us over us that day, because the lady came back and said, "Oh, I get your flight out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon." I said, "Oh, that's great." But when he was recuperating from after his surgery, I pitched the idea. I had written two prior books, two books on football history, and I pitched the idea of writing a book about his life. And I knew obviously that he was a great basketball player, and I knew that in some ways overlooked by particularly the Hall of Fame at that juncture. There was a number of articles. When I started the research on this book, I encountered a number of articles about how there was sort of they called it the JoJo White threshold, that there were many people that had made it to the Hall of Fame with credentials that were less than JoJo's. And there was a lot of speculation as to why, the Hall of Fame was year after year overlooking him. And, there's lots of theories, and no one really knows the answer to that. It may be as simple as the fact that there were so many Celtics in the Hall of Fame. When the Celtics won every game in the 1960s, except for 1967, they later on picked 1967 Philadelphia 76ers as the team of the decade. So, go figure. I mean, that kind of, I was going to use a different word, but it kind of upset Red Auerbach, let's say. And, rightfully so, I think. But, I learned that, Tommy Heinsohn suggested a title for the book when we didn't have one, which was The Forgotten Celtic. And I didn't like that. I thought it was a little too pejorative. And I'll tell you a little bit later how I came up with the title, because it's an interesting story. But there's a little bit of truth in that. So the mission is to sort of, put JoJo's story out there for people to be able to enjoy. And honestly, from the very beginning, I never really talked about this. I had this little secret ambition that somehow the book might help get him in the Hall of Fame. You could almost call it, Tuesdays with JoJo instead of Maury. He lives on the North Shore, not far from here, and I would come out from where I live, which is in central Massachusetts, and I would spend a couple hours with him, and I would chat with him. And week after week, I would gain a better perspective of who he was, not just as a basketball player, but as a human being. And what I learned as I spent those weeks with JoJo, interviewing him, was that the story of JoJo White off the court is perhaps more compelling than the story of JoJo White on the court, which is saying a lot, because he was a great basketball player, as I think we all know. But the story's much bigger than that. And the other thing I found out about the story of JoJo White is that in many cases, his career was affected by what was happening in our country at the time. And in other cases, it actually shaped what was happening in our country at various times. We all know that the racial attitudes of America in the 60s were worse than they are today. It's a debate that goes on in our country, but certainly back in the 1960s, things were a lot different than they are today. And JoJo can tell you about when he played at Kansas, going into opposing gyms and all the cheerleaders having ape costumes on with the name of the black Kansas players on their back. He can tell you about leaving arenas where they had to get on the bottom of the bus because they were bricked, not stoned, bricked by fans from the opposing team. So there was a lot of racial difficulties, and in fact, one of his boyhood idols was Oscar Robertson, and he wanted to go to Cincinnati, but the racial difficulties in Cincinnati were significant enough that his parents didn't want him to go there. He as a young man, took to basketball. He was the youngest of 7 kids. As you all probably know, sometimes in bigger families, the youngest child has to sort of compete with all the oldest children. And sometimes that makes them better competitors. And I think that probably has a certain amount of truth with JoJo. I've talked to his siblings, and they said really from the time he was a little kid, JoJo was intensely competitive. And he was a great athlete, not only in basketball, but some people may realize, if you've read anything about JoJo, is that he actually had an opportunity to play professional baseball or professional football. But basketball was his first love. His parents used to be concerned when he was young because he would be out late at night, and sometimes when kids are out late, we know that that's not necessarily a good thing. And he would come home, and his parents would get concerned, and they say, "JoJo, where have you been?" And he would say, "I was down at the court shooting baskets." And they believed him for the most part, but they were a little skeptical until they saw him play his first high school game, where he became a dominant player. That's where he got his famous nickname. His given name is Joseph, but he had a coach who was very important in his life named Jody Bailey. And apparently one day they were doing a little chalkboard work, and he wasn't being as attentive as he should have been. And the coach, sort of in a staccato voice, said, "Joe, Joe," and it stuck. So ever after, JoJo White. He then had, as all of us do that succeed in our lifetimes, have mentors, and in this case, of course, coaches that made a big difference in his career. And certainly Ted Owens at Kansas University, it was a big part of JoJo's life. He still is to this day. They still keep in touch. I had the incredible honor of interviewing Ted Owens a couple of times. He's an unbelievably wonderful human being. JoJo White was his first recruit as a new head coach of the Kansas University basketball program. And him and Sam Miranda, who was the assistant coach, were able to win over JoJo's parents when they came to St. Louis to visit JoJo and try to recruit him. And that was very important. JoJo White grew up, his father was a Baptist minister, and his mother was a very devout lady with great faith, and he wouldn't have gone to any college that his parents didn't approve of. Ted told me that when he recruited JoJo and they took their first trip, which was the family's first airplane ride out to Kansas, that he could not have set a better scene for the recruitment. Apparently it was this time of year, it was in October. It was a very blue, beautiful sky out in Lawrence. And Lawrence happened to be playing one of their rivals in football, Oklahoma, who they usually lost to. But this particular year, they had a special player. Anybody know who that might have been? Also later on played for the Chicago Bears. That's right, Gale Sayers. And Gale Sayers was, of course, a very special football player. And he helped lead Kansas to a big upset over Oklahoma that day. So Ted said, "Mark, I couldn't have scripted it better." And JoJo decided to attend, I think he had over 200 scholarship offers to play basketball at colleges around the country. And he picked Kansas. And one of the things that happened was, he ended up, back in those days, you had to play a year of junior varsity or freshman basketball. You couldn't play for 4 years. You could only have 3 years of varsity eligibility at most. And he ended up becoming eligible to play on the varsity out of sequence. So his first eligibility to play on the varsity squad came in January of 1966. The coach had to make a decision. They could bring JoJo up to the varsity squad then, or delay that a semester and wait until the fall of that year, fall of 1966. So Ted did something democratic. He brought it to the team. And the team, even though it meant some of those guys were going to lose minutes, and in one case a guy lost his starting role, they voted unanimously to bring JoJo up to the varsity squad because they really believed that they had a shot at winning the NCAA tournament. Well, something historical collided with that chance of winning the NCAA tournament. JoJo, in fact, as I said, was elevated to the varsity squad. After a few games, he ended up becoming a starter. He ended up contributing significantly to the second half of the Jayhawk season, and they made it into the NCAA tournament, and they made it to the regional finals, and they ran up against a team called Texas Western. Anybody here seen the movie Glory Road? It's made by Disney. Well, that movie is about Texas Western, and the of course important point of that movie is Don Haskins playing with a largely African American team, having a Cinderella season. They went 17-1 in their regular season, making it into the NCAA tournament, and they came up against the Kansas Jayhawks. And with about 8 seconds left in the game, they were called for a charge, Texas Western. The ball went over to the Jayhawks. It was inbounded to JoJo White. The score was tied. It was inbounded to JoJo White. JoJo took it the length of the court, put up a long jump shot, fell back into the crowd, into the arms of apparently a Jayhawk fan, who in jubilation shook him from side to side. He saw his team come off the bench in jubilation as well, celebrating the shot that he sunk, which he never saw go in because of what happened. And then something happened. And JoJo, were you in bounds?
I was.
One of the first things I asked him after doing some research, on my own about it, and just in that same way, he answered it. Not very argumentatively, very matter-of-factly. He said he was in bounds. Well, the referee thought otherwise. So the shot was called off. The game went into overtime, and ultimately Texas Western prevailed. Texas Western made it to the finals, played Kentucky, which was a team coached by Adolph Rupp, a legendary college basketball coach, also a bigot. And Don Haskins, in the face of this, being an overwhelming underdog, some people thought by 30 points, started an all-black 5, first time that had been done in an NCAA tournament. And you can guess what happened, right? Texas Western won the game. And the following season, the face of the SEC was literally changed. There were more opportunities for African-American basketball players. So although Jayhawks didn't win the game, JoJo's shot and JoJo's performance in that game actually changed the history of college basketball. I've seen photographic evidence of this shot. I've seen it broken down into cells. And you can't tell from looking at the photographs whether JoJo's foot is in bounds or out of bounds. But what you can see is the ref. And as the ref is proceeding down court behind JoJo, he is not looking at the floor. He's looking down at the basket. Not until the ball was released at the apex, of course, of JoJo's jump, and JoJo was coming down, does the ref direct his attention to the floor. So the ref might have saw where JoJo came down, but he never saw where JoJo left from. And so I take his word for it. But it's a quirk, and an interesting historical quirk, because obviously it was important to basketball. Not long after that, a couple of years later, JoJo had the opportunity to make the U.S. Olympic basketball team. Anybody know what year the Olympics incorporated basketball for the first time? That's a tough trivia question. Yes.
54.
No, earlier than that. Huh? Earlier than 54. Earlier than that. 1936. Can anybody guess how many basketball games a U.S. Olympic team lost between 1936 and 1964? That's right, none, 0. So that summer, before the games were played in October, that summer, before the games were played, well, let me back up first. Something happened in November of 1967. There was a guy named Harry Edwards. Anybody know what he did in November of 1967? He was a black activist. Well,
The fist?
well, prelude to that. Prelude to that. He attempted to organize a boycott of the 68 games by African-American athletes. They demanded some changes. They demanded that Avery Brundage step down. They demanded integration. They demanded some other countries not be able to participate, South Africa for one. Their demands fell on deaf ears. Then a couple weeks later, somebody else joined that boycott that put it on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Anybody know who that was? No? But a very, very important civil rights figure. Should be an easy one.
M.L. King?
Yeah, Martin Luther King got involved. So that put it on every news, like I said, every newspaper in the country was front page news. And there were basketball players that didn't participate in the 1968 Olympic Games. One very notable one, anybody know who that would be? Very tall guy, had two names. One, he had a Muslim name, but he had another name before that. Lou L. Cinders was his given name. Abdul Jabbar is who we came to know him as, right? He did not participate in those games. Now, that team, in the summer of '68, went to Europe and played 10 exhibition games. Lost four of the 10, 2 to Yugoslavia and 2 to Russia. That was a big deal. And that made newspaper headlines, and many pundits believed that the U.S. Olympic team might not even get a medal, never mind win the gold. So that's a big deal when you consider they hadn't lost a game from 1936 to 1964. But JoJo White was not in Europe with the team. He was in Lawrence doing a youth basketball camp. When he joined the team in 1968, he never considered the boycott. He just wasn't a political thing for him. He just loved basketball and he wanted to play basketball. When he joined the team, under him and Spencer Haywood, who was a phenom in those games because he came out of a junior college. Not a lot of fanfare with Spencer Haywood. But the two of them led the U.S. team to 9 straight wins and a gold medal, which was another, obviously, huge accomplishment in his career. Then, back in those days, they had the ABA. And the ABA was very intent on getting the best college talent they could to compete with the NBA. So they would pay certain top college players a lot of money to come play in the ABA. JoJo was ranked really right behind Lou Alcindor in terms of his talent for being drafted by an NBA team. Back in those days, you had to complete your college education before you couldn't go into the pros out of high school. You couldn't go into the pros after a year in college.
No, you wanted to.
You wanted to. You wanted to. But you had to play your years. So of the people eligible for the draft, it was really him, Lou Alcindor, number 1, and JoJo, number 2. So he had this unique opportunity to develop where his coach, who served as his agent, he didn't have a professional agent, and a judge that was an alum from Kansas brought him to a hotel, a Holiday Inn in Kansas City. And in one room was the ABA, and in the other room was Carl Scheer, the vice president of the NBA, trying to get JoJo to sign a contract that said he wouldn't play in the ABA. It wasn't a draft, it wasn't a contract for a team. It was just a contract to say that he would allow himself to be drafted by an NBA team and for a certain dollar amount, and he would honor that draft. Well, I mean, think of could you be in a better circumstance? Have two leagues competing for you in the same hotel, right? So JoJo just wanted to play. He was like, I'll sign. His coaches got him, coach and the judge got him a good deal. He signed that contract. It was kind of a hush-hush thing. The NBA didn't really advertise that stuff back then. But the funny part of this story is that the NBA was redecorating their offices at that time, and they were painting. And they came to believe that the painters were spies for the ABA. And they were actually discussing JoJo White the day the painters were there. And they took the painters into another room and interrogated them for like a half an hour till they finally figured out that they were in fact just painters. That wasn't so far-fetched because later on the ABA admitted that they had bugged the NBA office. So this was like, high-end stuff. The JoJo, as I said, ended up signing that contract. But then something happened before the NBA draft. He was drafted by the Army. And because back then we had a war going on, his draft stock in the NBA plummeted. A team that drafted JoJo wouldn't know when he would be eligible to play. They didn't know if he would ever play. Who knows if he'd ever even come back from Vietnam. So a funny thing happened. Instead of the Celtics won the championship in 1969 with Sam Jones and Bill Russell their last year. By the way, Sam was just here last weekend and a little book tour with him, and because of having the honor of writing this book, I was able to write his biography as well, called 10 Times a Champion. But those guys retired. Sam wanted to retire in '67, but he hung around for his friend, Bill Russell, because Bill became a player coach for the last 2 years. Wanted to make sure that they were able to get a couple of championships. Sam said if he knew how good JoJo was, he might have stuck around even another year. And JoJo once told me that if he knew how Larry Bird was coming around, he might have stuck around a little bit longer with the Celtics. So they had the last pick in the draft at number 9. So, no one before he got drafted by the Army at least thought that JoJo White would be hanging around at number 9. But there he was on draft day at number 9. So Red Auerbach drafted him. The big story the next day in the AP, in the newspapers across the country, was a story written by a guy named Ira Burkow, and there was a coin flip for 1 and 2 between Phoenix and Milwaukee. Milwaukee won the toss and took Jabbar. Phoenix got Neil Walk, but that was a 2-sentence thing. The rest of the article was about how Red Auerbach and the Celtics got an early Easter basket in the form of JoJo White. But the next problem was, how was Red Auerbach going to get JoJo White onto the Celtics bench? So, interesting thing, because I asked JoJo, I said, how did that all go down? And I think his reply to me initially was, Red was a powerful man, and he wasn't wrong. So I did some newspaper today. With newspapers being digitized, it's a lot easier to go back into all those old newspapers. And I read a lot of these old newspaper articles, and there was a lot of controversy that involved 2 U.S. senators. The senator from Missouri, whose name was Thomas Eagleton, you might remember him, who became famous a few years later in '72 as McGovern's first running mate. And then a guy named Abraham Ribicoff from Connecticut. Both senators denied having anything to do with JoJo's case. Said maybe some low staffer in our office might have heard of it, but we don't know anything about it. Well, Red was able to have somebody take JoJo to a house in Stamford, Connecticut, and take an oath of residency there. That house happened to be owned by a guy named Carl Scheer. Remember I mentioned his name earlier? He was the vice president of the NBA. And the president of the NBA, Walter Kennedy, said, Carl's got a big house in Stamford, and JoJo and his wife are welcome to stay there anytime. So back in those days, you could go into the reserves out of Connecticut for some reason with relative ease. I know other people that did this. And JoJo ended up in the Marine Corps Reserve and then found himself, not too long after that, at Parris Island in boot camp with the Marines. So the people out in St. Louis, the draft board that drafted him from his hometown, said, well, how does that happen? How do you get drafted by the Army and then end up in the Marine Corps Reserve? So they filed a protest. So this hit the newspapers. It was big news for a while. And General Hershey, who was the head of the Selective Service, got involved. Apparently, read between the lines, a couple of U.S. senators got involved. And 2 weeks later, General Hershey said, well, you can't very well take a boy out of the service and then put him back in. St. Louis Draft Board dropped their protest. JoJo became a proud Marine. By November, he was on the Celtics bench. By January, he was a starter. Celtics weren't very good in 1969. That same guy, Ira Burkow, in one article in the spring of 1970, referred to JoJo White as a rose in a garbage dump. I don't think that's entirely fair because, of course, John Havlicek was with the team. But the third part of that triumph hadn't yet been drafted. And who was that? Everybody knows who that was, right? Dave Cowens, that's right. And once Dave Cowens came along, the rest was history, so to speak. And it's funny because, writing this book was a joy because I got to speak to a lot of guys that I watched as a kid playing basketball. Dave Cowens, of course, was one of them. And Dave I called cold. And he was like, like, who are you? And I explained to him what I was doing, and then like 2.5 hours later, my wife was calling me for dinner. I said, Dave, I gotta go. I gotta get off the phone. He goes, just no, one more thing. And I literally couldn't get away from him. But he made a point in that conversation, which I thought was really fascinating, and that was, the Celtics of their era, the 70s, never really got their proper due, because they're kind of sandwiched in between, the Bill Russell years, which of course are, a bit of a different game, but obviously incredible success. I mean, 8 years, 8 straight championships. I mean, Bill Russell and Sam Jones are the winningest duo in sports history and will always be that. And then, then it was, the 70s, and they had 2 championships, but for a separated John Havlicek shoulder, probably a third. They still have the best regular season record, 1972, 68 wins. I mean, they were a good team. Then the Bird years came along, and they had 3 championships. So in some ways, I see a certain amount of parity between the 2 teams. But what the Bird years had that the 70s didn't have was big-time TV and rivalries. Lakers, Celtics, Bird, Magic, and much more money in the game, and of course a whole lot more glare and attention. So I think Dave was right. I don't think they ever really got the attention they deserved. Like I said at the beginning, in writing this book, I've formed a bond and a friendship with JoJo, one of the most genuine human beings I've ever met. I can recall going into the Boston Garden during the playoffs, I think it was in 2010, when they were playing the Heat. LeBron was with the Heat then. They only needed to win 1 out of the last 2 games, and Game 6 was at the Garden. And I think that was the first time I ever walked into the place with him, and the place went crazy. And I'm looking up into the stands, and I'm saying, who are these people? They weren't even born when he was playing. Like, why the adulation, And then after being there several more games with him, I realized that he's the most gracious man you ever want to meet. I mean, he is so good to fans, and always has been that way. And I think that was a big reason for that kind of respect. He's just one of the most genuine and warm people I know. When I was about 3/4 of the way through this book, he asked me if we had a title. Now that seems like a very simple question, but if you really get to know JoJo, that's like, he never asked anybody for anything. So I was like, oh, he asked me for something. That's kind of cool. And I said, every book I've ever written, I've never had a title at the beginning. Title always comes someplace in the process. And as I said, I didn't have one for this one. And that day that he asked me that, he shared with me a scrap of paper that his mother gave him when he was a young boy, and he had reflected on it virtually every day of his life after that. And it really describes his philosophy. And I knew immediately it would be the epigraph of the book. And the only person that he'd ever shared that with besides his wife was me. And I felt particularly honored by that. And I'll read it to you. It says, have you made someone happy or have you made someone sad? What have you done with the day that you had? God gave it to you to do just as you would. Did you do something wicked or did you do something good? Did you hand out a smile or just give out a frown? Did you pick someone up or push someone down? What have you done with your beautiful day? God gave it to you. Don't throw it away. I said, what a philosophy to live life by. And it kind of dovetailed later on with something he said to those kids out in Iowa. He said, God gave me certain talents, and they're not mine to keep. I have to share them with those coming up. He says, but the funny thing, the more I share them, the more they come back. And that's just love. That's all it is. It's the whole principle of really to me, that's what life is about. So I was driving away from his house that day, and I was just about to say, you know what? In basketball, sometimes the idea is to make your shot count, and the philosophy of that poem is to make every day count. So I said, make it count. Has a little bit of a ring to it. I was going to call his house, and his wife called me. So I said, oh, opportune that you would call me because I want to run this title by you, which I did. And of course they liked it because it's on the cover. But that day she said, Paul Silas wants to talk to you and he's in a golf tournament with Michael Jordan. He doesn't golf and he's bored. So could you give him a call? And I said, oh, he wants to talk to me instead of Michael Jordan? So I said, okay, I can do that. But turns out that there were other reasons he'd rather talk to me than Michael Jordan too. But Paul Silas is, not unlike JoJo, a really great human being for a lot of reasons. So it's been an incredible honor to write this book. And, you know, I told you I started to write Sam's book on the day that Deflategate broke. The Monday after that AFC Championship game at Gillette Stadium back in, I guess that was January of 2015, right? And the interesting thing is that, you know, I came back and I called Tommy Heinsohn, of course, because Tommy played with Sam, and he had mentioned to me, he goes, you know, Mark, he goes, you have to quarterback the effort of getting JoJo White in the Hall of Fame. He says, me, Tommy? He goes, Mark, at this point, you probably know more about his career than anybody else. And I says, well, that's flattering. He goes, I'll help you. You know, we can work together on it. And I says, yeah, absolutely, let's do it. So I called JoJo's wife about 4 days later during the middle of the week, and I had mentioned the conversation I had with Tommy about doing research on Sam's book. And she said, Mark, the NBA All-Star game is Saturday, which was just a few days away. And she said, that's when they announced the finalists for the Hall of Fame. I said, well, let's keep our fingers crossed. There's not, you know, it's only a couple of days away. There's no point in doing anything until they make the announcement. So the Saturday, that Saturday after the conversation with Debbie, Friday night I went to bed and I woke up around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm usually a sound sleeper, and started thinking about JoJo a little bit, and got back to sleep, and I went to my office, which is my usual routine on Saturday morning. I take the mail and putter around a little bit, and phone rang, and it was Debbie, and she said, guess what happened? She goes, the NBA called, and JoJo's a finalist. And I said, oh my God bless that. So I called Tommy, and he started to laugh because he already knew, because Tommy was already in the Hall of Fame as a player, but he became inducted as a coach the same year, JoJo's coach. Well, he was a veteran selection, so he didn't have to get the 18 of 24 votes that JoJo did as a finalist. So he was in. But JoJo had to wait an additional month or so to find out whether he got enough votes to be, in fact, inducted. So that was a long 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it was. I remember we had a book signing in Natick in the end of March, and I said to Debbie, they're supposed to announce this at the NCAA championship game. That's in Indiana. They got to tell you ahead of time. They can't tell you the day of and have you go fly out there. And she just kind of brushed me off, and I don't know, we went on to something different. And I had a nephew visit from Florida, and he wanted to see the Celtics. He wanted to see the Garden and the Celtics. He'd never been. So I said, well, how would you like to go with Nick, my son, and sit with Debbie and JoJo? I said, oh, that would be kind of cool. So I made arrangements for that to happen. And I wanted to take him up to this area to see some of Massachusetts, Salem in particular. And I stopped at JoJo's house to pick up the tickets so we didn't have to use the will call window. And it was April 1st, I remember the date, and we were talking, and I said to Debbie, when are you going to find out? Because it was I think 4 or 5 days they were supposed to make the announcement formally. And she started, I could just see something in her eye. I said, you're going to find out today, aren't you? And she started to laugh. And she said, yeah, I am, but I'm not supposed to tell a soul. And she says, but what I will do is I'll text you either thumbs up or thumbs down. All right, I think I did that in reverse, right? Thumbs down or thumbs up. So I said, all right, fair enough. So we went off to Salem. We went to the House of the Seven Gables, one of my favorite things to do. I'm a Nathaniel Hawthorne fan. And of course, I had my cell phone off to be respectful. And I noticed that my phone had lit up and I saw a missed call, Debbie White. I said, holy crap, that's not a good sign. Why wouldn't she just text me? Why is she calling me? So I started getting nervous. So we left that house, and if you've been there, you know that the Hawthorne house is there now. So that's the second part of the tour. So in between, I figured I'd try to call her quick and find out what was going on, and she missed the call. So I go into the Hawthorne house, got the phone off again, and she called me. I didn't hear it, of course, because the phone's off, missed call. I says, all right. So I'm getting ready to leave the Hawthorne house to try to get her on the phone, and the tour guide said, no, there's only, my family, I think, we were the only people in the place. And they said, that's okay, you can make the call in here. So I called her up, and she answered the phone, hello. I go, oh no. And then she screamed at the top of her lungs and said, April Fools. And that's the best I've ever been stung in April Fools in my life. And she just hung up. That was the end of it. So obviously I put two and two together and knew that he had made it. And I was so happy for JoJo and Debbie, and you know, some of his peers, and Tommy specifically said that the book helped get him in the Hall of Fame. I don't know if that's true or not. If it had any contribution, it was my honor to do it. And last September, finally, JoJo White was inducted to the NBA Hall of Fame. Long overdue, well-deserved, and that's sort of from the end of the story from my perspective. At this point, JoJo and I will try to field a few questions that you might have. After we're done with that, I do have copies of the book available. It's a very wholesome book. That's the way I write, and I write in a style that can be read and enjoyed by an adolescent as well as an adult. Book's done, I'm very honored, the book's done very well. And they're $25, and of course JoJo and I will sign them. And I can take a credit card as well as cash or a check, any of that works. And after we finish the Q&A, we'd be happy to sign them for you if you're interested. So I guess we're gonna be sharing this little microphone, JoJo. So who has a question? Yes? Sorry? Did JoJo always have fun when he was playing?
I loved it every minute I was on the floor. I really enjoyed and loved what I was doing.
I would have guessed that was the answer. Haven't been with him a few times. Yeah. Yes?
Who's your favorite teammate to play with?
Pardon?
Your favorite teammate to play with?
Havlicek.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was, I mean, in terms of being in your head, what we need to do any day, or him personal, to get something done. You know, you can expect on your team, if Havlicek is on it, some shit is up.
A funny thing about John Havlicek that JoJo told me early on, as well as Sam told me the same thing, because Havlicek's career overlapped the 60s and the 70s, and played with both guys, and they both told me the same thing. He was a tireless athlete, and he didn't sweat. And JoJo told me, I used to follow him around. I couldn't figure out, why don't this guy sweat? You know, like, what the heck is he doing? I mean, he runs forever, and he doesn't sweat. And Sam said the same thing to me. I said, Sam.
I got tired of hitting it in my face.
I said, Sam. I said, I asked him that. I called, because obviously I got to talk to John too. John says, Mark, it's not a good thing. It's like how we were training at Ohio State. We didn't drink water. So it was like back in those days, drinking water was like weakness, you know, so they didn't drink water, which is why he didn't sweat. So I told, just this weekend, Sam said the same to me. Why did Havlicek never sweat? I said, Sam, because he never drank water. Any of you young people here? Don't do that. Yes.
Who was your favorite opponent?
Favorite opponent?
It looked like when we were coming through, I mean, in New York, they had,
Willis,
you know, the guy with, what's his name?
Willis Reed?
Not Willis, the backcourt, Frazier.
Walt Frazier.
That, that crew of guys, we had to go through them to get to where we tried to go. So I loved every minute of what I was doing, being with the Boston Celtics.
He loved the Big O, too.
Yeah.
Oscar Robertson, as I said earlier, was his idol. And when they won in '74, the Big O was on the Milwaukee Bucks.
Yeah.
And he actually went into the visitor locker room to talk to him. Yes? Back here, did you have a question? Oh, okay, all the way back. What current players Who do you like currently?
The guys that I have in utmost,
Isaiah?
no, first start with John Havlicek.
Well,
Guys that came to play, get night in and night out. It wasn't like, you got to get you up, hey, they were ready to play.
He means current player.
Well,
Somebody playing now.
they haven't rounded out yet.
I had a feeling that's what he was going to say. Somebody asked him once someplace about playing defense. Somebody's a current player's ability to play defense, and JoJo.
They were definitely going through it to get to the end to get paid. I mean, that was right here. There's a lot of things that has to be passed down to know that you can show it on the floor because you work on it every day. Not these guys.
It's a different game.
Yeah, it's a totally different game.
He told me once that I forget the player, but they were somebody asked a question about their defensive abilities, and his response was he couldn't guard a parked car. which I still remember because I thought it was pretty funny. Yes.
Was the Game 5 your favorite game to play ever, or was there another one?
Oh, well, you knew
Game 5 of '76, was that your favorite game? Or?
we had the ball inbound when they turned it over. See, once we got a keep chance at that ball, the opposite team, they're not going to win. Not even a little bit.
Cut your tape off that game, right?
For sure.
When they thought the game was over until Richie Powers decided it wasn't. They had to go back onto the floor. They had already taken their tape off, so
Yeah.
it was quite a night. Yes.
But from one alumni to another.
Yeah, you got the right hat on.
Yeah.
Rock chalk.
I started at KU about 4 years after you graduated, and then Ted Owens was still there in his last years, and then you came back in the late '70s. So I want to ask you a question about other athletic things past your basketball. You came back as the assistant athletic director, and then athletic director at KU. So I want to ask you that general question about how there's been opportunities growing for both genders, boys and girls, women and men, and how you think that has helped shape the game in the world. I know that's a very open-ended question, but any thoughts on that?
I need to think we need to go back and stretch it out even further. I mean, the money you can make is hurting a lot of young, developing, athletes, because they are caught up on, how much I got in my purse. You have to go to jail, not jail, know where to go to get yourself in the best condition you can be. You'll scare yourself.
JoJo's got 5 girls.
I do.
Yeah,
They're awesome. Ooh.
they're all good athletes too. And his son, his oldest, Brian, was a great athlete. Played at Dartmouth, and had a tryout with the Patriots and made it to the last cut. And now he's an actor. You'll see him in a lot of Tyler Perry movies. Stomp the Yard. Anybody ever see that movie? That's a pretty popular one. He played the coach of the good team in that movie. So I told him someday maybe you'll play JoJo White. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
Can you please tell us the favorite starting Celtics team that you were a part of?
Which year? You have a starting team that you were?
The names.
Or the names?
Havlicek.
Havlicek, for sure.
Havlicek,
Cowens.
Cowens,
Yourself.
I was in there all the stuff. You know, I mean, we want defense tonight, this night, and offense. I have to give them what they want.
How about Charlie Scott?
Charlie, sometime he's can be unbelievable, but you have to keep him, you know, on what I'm talking about, because he turn it back around and go Charlie way.
There's a funny story that, that year the Celtics traded for Charlie Scott, and there was speculation about it ahead of time. And Bob Ryan of the Boston Globe said that'll never happen. In fact, the line he uses says it's more probable that Arthur Fiedler will be a Celtic than Charlie Scott. Then guess what happened? And Bob Ryan's proposition was that he would never get along with JoJo. That that they wouldn't be able to play together, and the Celtics were at our back. Charlie and JoJo proved them all wrong, because they were complementary. JoJo's sort of demeanor was quiet, calm, determined. Charlie was fiery, and JoJo kept Charlie in check for the most part. He's right. And great story is after that game 5, I mean JoJo. They played 36 hours later across the country. So unselfishly, he went to Charlie on the plane ride to Phoenix and said, look, you're going to have to turn it up. I don't have the gas I had, before Game 5 started.
You have to have some gas.
and that's what happened. He inspired Charlie Scott. Charlie scored 20 in that game, played quite a few minutes, and they, of course, wrapped up the championship. So that's an example of the exactly opposite of what Bob Ryan was talking about. His reporting, I've never been a fan, let's put it that way. Yes?
I had a general question about the role of the athlete.
Yeah.
My question is this. Does an athlete, in JoJo's opinion, have an obligation to reflect on current events, or should he just play the game?
No, you still have to know what games you fit in. I mean, just to say, I'm a guard player. Well, if you haven't played that position, who is hell on your feet?
What he's talking about in terms of positions is whether you should get involved in politics as an athlete, I think is what you're getting at, right?
For me, not even at all.
Which is completely reflective of how he handled the boycott. It just wasn't about that for him. I mean, it was, he loved basketball. He was a basketball player, and he wanted to play basketball. He wasn't.
I played all sports now.
Yeah.
Football, basketball, baseball. I played all of those.
Yes.
What team would you consider the best Celtics team of all time? Which team do you think was the best? You have to pick one.
It's not one, because it's what's on one each in one of those teams, and they fit on well with other players they're playing with, and then they take them and play against other teams. I mean, Larry Bird and Havlicek and these are some outstanding athletes. And you don't hear that much because they know that, hey, they don't have to give them much because we're giving them everything they need. They come to us, they're getting it all.
Way back.
Yeah, lifelong Celtics fan, a real pleasure to be here. Can you offer any advice to an up-and-coming player? Like, what made you get to where you are today? Was it like just focusing on like fundamentals? Was it your athleticism? Was there something else that kind of kept you striving to be the best you could be?
Well, the thing is you have to continue to train or develop, as you go. Sometimes you think because we had a good year that it's going to next year's gonna be like that again. Well, other teams are working to come and wheel your ass a few times. You see, so it's every time you go out there, you gotta be ready to do your thing.
Team too, right, Joe?
Absolutely, it's gotta be TAM, there's no I in the word,
Yeah.
The
Fundamentals were, Ted Owens was a fundamental coach. And one of the things he told me when I interviewed him was, one of JoJo's early games as a Jayhawk, he dominated the floor. Guess how many points he scored? Two, because he played defense. And, and he passed the ball. He was a point guard, obviously. So, those things back then were important. Today, one of the themes that JoJo talks about a lot is, money has changed the game. Players get paid. They get validated with money because, unfortunately, in America, sometimes people equate success with money. Not true, in my opinion. But it validates them. And as
the color of money. What color?
I think it's green. But they control who the coach is. I mean, they play when they want to. Obviously, when he played, it was different. A lot of us probably lament that. But the world has changed. The game has changed. We'll take a couple more questions. Yes, right here.
Do you like the three-point shot?
Yeah.
You like the advent?
I mean, if I have to shoot it, I can shoot it down. But we try and use up, with what we have to stretch it all, bring it in close, depending on who we're playing against, and vice versa. You see, to be able to adjust, at what you do or what your team needs, it means adding more with the guys who are, as you go, you start to understand why, you're over here and not over there laying on the floor. You see? And so when everybody get in under sync and understand what you're trying to do, then you see them play, in a serious position, because everybody knows where they're supposed to be, whether it's be offense or defense.
All right, we'll take two more. The young man back there, way back.
Who is your favorite team in the NBA?
Ooh, I knew
Currently?
you were tough.
Oh, your current favorite
Give
team.
me a break.
I think, young man, I think he bleeds green, if that tells you.
No, to be for real, it's just a lot of good teams out there that, because the way a lot of things have changed, in terms of, when the teams and coaches are broken down through, bringing teams to your team, the good teams who used to be together have broken up because it's money here, it's money there, and they've gotten away from understanding what makes you effective is understanding how to play the game.
In other words, what he's saying, young man, is that today's basketball, the teams aren't as cohesive because of contracts and trades, financial circumstances. In his day, the teams tended to have the same players year after year, which is not necessarily the case today. One more question, way back.
How was it like playing in the NBA finals?
What's it like playing in the finals?
It's all that's if you've come in early, if you've come in late. I mean, your bottom line is we'd love to, as a team, win it all. Because once you do it, you can kind of lean back. You kind of live. As I'm back in this chair, you can lean back and.
There's no other way for him.
And then they start looking back at you.
Yeah.
You see, and then you get a chance to.
Because I'll take that young man's question back there. Yeah, that'll be the last one. Okay.
Do you like playing Larry Bird?
I sure did. He was one of the outstanding players that I got a chance to play with at some time as we were developing. You see, it's about developing and get as best condition as you can get in to be able to compete with the style of talents that are out there in the in the house now.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the Beverly Library and Beverly Access TV. Thank you very much.